So, whether you follow K-pop or not, there's been this drama unfolding around NewJeans, one of the hottest girl groups out right now. It involves one CEO trying to undermine another one very publicly. Today on the show, you'll hear about NewJeans and the very public battle over the K-pop industry. I'm Alamin Abdul Mahmoud, and this is Commotion. Why don't we get things going with this?
I'm super shy, but wait a minute while I make you mine. Darling, 지금도 you're on my mind. All the time I wanna tell you, but I'm super shy.
That is Super Shy by NewJeans. It is one of 5 songs that the K-pop group has had on the Billboard Hot 100 since they debuted just 2 years ago. NewJeans also holds the record as the fastest K-pop act to reach 1 billion streams on Spotify. The group has been incredibly successful in Korea and also internationally. But there has been a fight going on behind the scenes. And I'll tell you about that fight, but here's the general outline of it. NewJeans belongs to ADOR, which is a subsidiary label of Hybe, the giant entertainment conglomerate that is home to BTS. But the CEO of ADOR, Hee-jin, who is also seen as kind of the creative force shaping NewJeans, is in a feud with Hybe. And it's getting really, really messy. We're going to talk about this feud. We're going to talk about the high stakes of the K-pop economy and the future of NewJeans. Michelle Cho is here. Jennifer Zhan is here. We're going to get into it. Michelle, Jennifer, welcome to the show, y'all.
Hey, nice to be here.
Listen, why don't we start, Jennifer, maybe before we dig into the feud, can you just lay out and describe NewJeans' sound and aesthetic?
Yeah, I think NewJeans debuted at a time when a number of popular K-pop groups were sort of trending towards grand production, like a hard-hitting chorus, a pop anthem.
Yeah.
I would say in comparison, NewJeans' overall sound is a bit more mellow, even though they still have very danceable beats. I think they felt very fresh, simple in a good way. And then their aesthetic pulls a lot from the 90s and 2000s. So I think there's an element of nostalgia to the group's appeal too.
Michelle, the way that this huge messy fight has unfolded has been really interesting. Why don't we lay out first why the story has captured the headlines as it's unfolded? Because this is ultimately a corporate battle, and corporate battles don't typically capture a lot of headlines. What do you think it is about this feud that's captured headlines?
Yeah. So for people who don't necessarily follow the ins and outs of the K-pop industry, I just try to outline it quickly. But I think that this feud has been really, really attention grabbing because it kind of pits 2 creative titans in the industry against each other. So Hee-jin, who's the creative director behind ADOR and NewJeans, and Bang Si-hyuk, who was the kind of visionary producer, the founder of Hybe, and the person who is responsible for BTS, right? The biggest success story that K-pop has had as a crossover phenomenon. So they were supposed to be partners in this kind of new way of doing things in the K-pop industry, which is this multi-label system. And so Hee-jin used to work for SM Entertainment, which is this older company. It's been around since the 90s. She was she was recruited very persuasively by Hybe to come and be part of this new thing. So that's why it's weird that now they're kind of at each other's throats trying to burn it down. The other thing is that NewJeans has been such a huge phenomenon, huge success. The biggest girl group debut, arguably the biggest K-pop group debut in many years. So that's what makes the discord and all of this infighting really surprising for people. How. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, Michelle, could you just lay out? I'm curious about the way that we're talking about Hee-jin in general, because it's not very often that you have producers who become famous, or as famous as the K-pop groups that they work with. But Hee-jin, who's behind NewJeans, kind of has become that famous. Before this feud erupted, how well known was she?
Yeah, so Hee-jin, she probably would be really well known to folks who have, again, been following the K-pop industry for a while.
Yeah.
She is the hugely successful in-house creative director for SM Entertainment, who was responsible for like all of the visual concept of all of the kind of most successful groups from the mid 2000s up until she left the company at the end of the 2010s. So she was there for like the kind of, seismic, I don't know, shifts in the industry and the growth of the industry, right?
The sort of explosion in popularity of K-pop. Yeah.
So she is also probably the most well-known and prominent woman in the industry. So the companies up until now have been headed by these dudes, mostly Gen X dudes.
Yeah.
So there's definitely this kind of like battle of the sexes element to what's going on here.
So I'm interested in the philosophical divide, Jennifer. I want to sort of lay this out. So you wrote about this fight between Hee-jin and Hybe for Vulture, and you described it this way, quote, depending on who you ask, this is either the story of an exec who got greedy and girl bossed too close to the sun, or of a brave creative who's being punished by a corporation for trying to protect her artistic vision. Can you briefly describe like what the crux of this dispute is?
Yeah, so basically, like from Hee-jin's perspective, this all started because she tried to bring up concerns that the team behind another Hybe group called Islet was like sort of plagiarizing NewJeans and ripping off her work. And more broadly, that the company also like sort of broke promises to her and wasn't as supportive as they could have been when it came to her plans for NewJeans, sort of her creative agency. And then on the other hand, Hybe has sort of denied all of that and instead accused Hee-jin of like business crimes, like conspiring with staff, planning a takeover, like illegal insider trading, letting a shaman be privy to like sensitive company info and
a
like
shaman.
Yes.
Okay.
Like making decisions for the label, and even like the claim is that the shaman was consulted on like the NewJeans lineup, like eliminate these people because they're possessed by a ghost, like that kind of thing. So
Wow. I want to just like pause and maybe explain to people a bit of the structure that we're working with here, because Hybe is this giant conglomerate, and underneath Hybe they have all of these sub-labels, and ADOR, the one that Hee-jin runs, only has NewJeans in it. But there's all these other sub-labels, and Jennifer, what you're sort of laying out there is other sub-labels under the sort of larger umbrella of Hybe have maybe started to use some of the NewJeans playbook, and Hee-jin is absolutely not having it because she's saying, no, my sub-label is the one that is the most successful. I don't have time to get into like all the details of this, unfortunately, and I highly encourage everybody to check out that Jennifer's excellent article that she wrote about this is just called is NewJeans okay, which is a big question that we're going to try to answer. But Michelle, I want people to maybe understand when we say a messy fight, what we really mean, because it has been very public. It has been a lot of press conferences back and forth. Maybe you want to explain the mess that's been unfolding.
Yes. Yeah. So back in April, when news of this, fight behind the scenes first broke, Min did an impromptu press conference to try and like get ahead of the news stories and the press releases that Hybe was going to put out and get the public on her side to try and understand where she was coming from. And so she did this kind of 2-hour rambling kind of thing, but it was so charged with emotion. Like she showed up and she was so upset. And so it was interesting because this, it ignited a lot of conversation about, especially, like a lot of women could sort of sympathize with the affect that she was showing of, being in a workplace where people steal your work, or, these kind of indifferent men are like, nah, whatever, like they're trying to gaslight you and tell you that you're not, like, what you're upset by is something that is irrelevant or doesn't exist, right? So that was the impact of this really public kind of spectacle of Min being very upset in public. And then since then, the Min side and Hybe side have just kind of doubled down, and they're actually filing, charges against each other. It turns out that the Hybe CEO has actually resigned, partly perhaps because of this feud.
Right.
But it's tanked also Hybe's, or I don't know if it's tanked, but it's definitely had a negative impact on Hybe stock prices too.
Yeah, there's something about the very public performance of this conflict. I mean, as sort of reading about this, like you hear about days where every camp would put out a press release, like once an hour, just kind of going back and forth. Very sort of willing to publicly air the dirty laundry. Jennifer, what do you think this story tells us about where we are with K-pop right now?
Yeah, I think we're starting to see just a lot more revealed about what happens behind the scenes, like how the sausage gets made, so to speak. I think getting insight into sort of what's come out during all of this, screenshots of messages or plans for how to debut the group. I think, we can't get into all the other examples here, but it's not the only recent case in K-pop that has sort of pulled the curtain back for us to hear more about contracts or behind the scenes culture at companies. There's actually been several cases of that recently.
Mm-hmm. Michelle, it seems like the way that Hybe has kind of set up this subsidiary label system, creating this internal competition thing, it's a big part of the issue here. And I'm interested, can you talk about why Hybe would want to maintain a system like this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the philosophy behind what Hybe is doing, perhaps in contrast to the existing system, is that it wanted to clearly kind of diversify its portfolio because, BTS's management company, Big Hit, turned into Hybe and started this multi-label thing. And Hybe Corporation also invests in lots of other things, there's a game company in its portfolio. They're working on the kind of fan messaging platform. They own Weverse, which is where pop idols can kind of communicate with their fandoms, right? So they're doing this tech thing as well as diversifying into this multi-label system. So it's supposed to preserve diversity, actually, because the way the other labels work is, there's a creative team that kind of decides what the different groups might sound or look like. So then that kind of creates a certain uniformity in the output of a particular label. Yeah. Hybe wants to have maximum diversity, again, to kind of keep its shareholders happy. But it's claiming that these labels run independently of each other, but it's as a parent company there to support them if they need stuff, right? So it's diversifying and centralizing at the same time, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so that's where some of the pressure is coming through because, that's why Min got so upset about this other group under the Hybe label, seemingly taking some of her concepts for NewJeans and applying them in a different case.
I was going to say, I know you have thoughts about that, about this idea of Min's allegations of plagiarism. Do you want to go into that, Michelle? What do you make of her allegations?
So I don't want to take sides in the feud because who knows what's what, but the one thing that kind of rubs me the wrong way is Min, her claims of ownership over the concepts, the general kind of concepts that NewJeans, embody, the kind of Y2K concept or the nostalgia thing, the freshness of youth, all of this. She has been in the industry since the mid 2000s. She knows that the way the industry works is when you're at the top, when you're leading the pack, everyone's going to try and emulate you. Okay, so that's not that's not some. It surprise.
Shouldn't be a surprise to her.
No, right. So I'm kind of that part. I don't know.
Yeah. I got about a minute left. Jennifer, last word to you. What does this all mean for NewJeans and for Min, you think?
Yeah, right now they're on a break. The plan was they're supposed to go on a world tour in 2025. And for now, Min's contract is still intact. So, you would hope that the sort of ongoing battles between her and Hybe would get to a place where they can work together smoothly for NewJeans' best interest. In my explainer, I kind of say that all this company infighting is kind of like a family feud. Mm-hmm. So it makes me think parents who don't get along and then stay together just because of their kids. It doesn't always solve the underlying issue or make for a happy family, so to speak.
That's a great analogy. Michelle, last word to you on this. Where does this leave NewJeans, you think?
I mean, hopefully they come through. It seems like both sides, Min and Hybe, they do want NewJeans' success to continue. So maybe they can make up for the sake of the kids. I don't know. We'll see. But if Min comes out and doesn't get kicked out of the company, some say that'll be bad too. But I don't know. She is really talented. I'll give her that. So yeah, we just have to see how it plays out.
There's still a lot more of this story to unfold, obviously. But in the meantime, I appreciate both of you guys being here. Jennifer, Michelle, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Anytime. Michelle Cho is a professor in the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Toronto. And Jennifer Zhan is a culture writer for Vulture based in Chicago. I'm Alamin Abdul Mahmoud. This is Commotion. Look, Nigeria has birthed some of music's biggest stars and brightest stars. We're talking about Wizkid. We're talking about Burna Boy. We're talking about Thames. And all of these people have just gotten incredibly famous over the last few years. And then there's Rema. He's an artist who's been rising and evolving. You'll probably recognize this big summer song.
Baby, calm down, calm down. Yo, this your body, it puts in my heart for lockdown, oh lockdown. Yo, you sweet life.
That's Rema and Selena Gomez with Calm Down. Well, Rema has got a new album. It's called HEIS, and it's unlike anything that you're hearing right now in music.
Forget it, fugazi. Lambo no, cause me a Richard Millie, the same week. I got me a new kaji. All the girl them love me, what I feeling, I am shining like I'm a precisely. What I no get enemy, but they hating on my water Fiji. Early morning.
That's Yayo from Rema. Matt Amha is here to talk about this moment for Rema. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Listen, it's always a delight to have you, especially when you're not rocking your Arsenal colors. I really appreciate it. Look, let me start with maybe a quote from Rolling Stone. Rolling Stone magazine called Rema Afrobeats' new superhero. That's quite a descriptor. What do you make of that description?
Yeah, I think, I can understand what it is that they're getting at. I've also, I've seen him described on this record in particular as an anti-hero, as even a villain, which I think, this is like a narrative framework that he's playing with on the album, and like the world building and the character play. It would not be out of place in a Christopher Nolan Batman film, for example. So yeah, I think that it's fitting. So
when we talk about superhero, we don't mean superhero for the genre. We mean just like literally the personality that he's adopting.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, like the kind of, there's a kind of like Marvel world building thing baked into the world that he's creating on this record in particular, I think.
Let's talk about that because Rema's mixed pop and R&B and hip hop in his earlier work. HEIS is not that. It focuses really heavily on local sounds. Why do you think he would make that pivot? Maybe take this approach to this album?
Well, I think, for starters, I think this album is a lament. This is a provocation. He is intentionally rejecting the way that African music has traditionally related to the Western world, frankly, and like to itself in many ways. I think, the mainstream was introduced to Rema, like the song Calm Down that you played earlier, as this happy-go-lucky Nigerian kid who was happy to be here. His voice hadn't dropped yet. He was on these hit records with Selena Gomez, on the Billboard charts, getting all of these major honors. This album is a rejection and an undoing of all of that. And, he is returning this Afrobeat tradition, which is an indigenous African music tradition, back to its roots. And so, there are no overtures to the West on here. There's no effort to like modify the sound to broaden the audience to a white audience. He's actually doubling down on elements of the sound which African artists have historically avoided. And so I think, it's all been done in this broader effort to reclaim the African music tradition. And, like typically African artists have wanted to like engender their sound to the West, to cross over, to assimilate, to make their works coherent in some way. On this record, he's refusing all of that.
The go-to examples might be Wizkid and Burna Boy over the last few years, and I think they've actually been very effective at that crossover. They've been sort of incredibly able to land with Western audiences, particularly Western hip hop audiences, who've just kind of accepted them as like, yep, that's a part of the general larger sort of mainstream. And then you get Rema, and you get Rema who's sort of actively rebelling against this idea because Calm Down That was not a medium hit. Like that was just such a colossal hit that if you're someone like Rema, it's an interesting reaction because the invitations will be coming left and right to say, this is a direction, do 10 more like this and you'll be the biggest star in the world. And he goes in a different direction. Not just a different direction. He, like unlike other Afrobeats albums from people like Burna Boy or Thames, most of he is not even in English. What do you make of the choices that he's making?
Yeah, I think, so Rema's talked pretty extensively about this decision that he's made here. And, I think he's talked about what is lost when African artists chase global appeal, about the fact that a number of Afrobeat artists have lost their roots, as he's put it. And, that this album essentially marks him returning to his. And he has said, we're listening to the voices of the world too much and we're forgetting about the voices back home. He said that African artists are watering down their sound so that it becomes easier for outsiders to copy or co-opt it. And so in that sense, shrouding your work in another language is a way of protecting it, So I think to your point, these choices are all intentional from him. The dominant language on this record is Nigerian Pidgin English, but a huge portion of it is in Yoruba and even Swahili. So this is a Pan-African work in that sense. And so for me, it's probably the most uncompromisingly African body of work that we've had since Burna Boy's African Giant, probably. I think in a kind of broader sense as well, the core of the music industry, the crucible of the music industry as we know it, runs through the United States.
Yeah.
So this has meant that artists from elsewhere are constantly having to make their art appeal to the American audience in some way. And, to this end, even rappers from Toronto or London, as well as Africa, have historically rapped in American accents or have, used American slang, have incorporated elements of Americana as a way of establishing this kind of rapport with the U.S. audience. Burna Boy's, one of his last records was executive produced by P. Diddy, for example, And so this project here is essentially the antithesis to all of that. This is a countermeasure.
Okay, I want to play another cut off the album. Have a listen to this.
All of my drama, they hit me for many years ago. All of my childhood, I lost cause I want feed family. Inside my house, so that what my face in all the show.
That's a bit of Now I Know off the album. Look, there seems to be, I think, a strong focus on cultural appreciation. This active decision to say we want less influence from Western sounds like pop and hip hop. Do you see Rema as kind of a preservationist? Is he sort of trying to preserve and protect these sounds and maybe be an archivist for them? Or was he trying to say, actually, these sounds are alive now and we should not really be forgetting about them? What do you think?
No, I do think there's a point to the archivist point, kind of point that you just made. I think that you're exactly right there. I think that's part of why I described the record as a lament. Like, in addition to all the world building and the musical elements, he's also making an argument on this record. He's looking other African artists in their eyes and Black people more generally and saying, it is okay for you to self-determine. It's okay not to build yourself in the image of the West. So there are tons of elements on this project that will be completely unintelligible to the average listener here in the West. But that, again, is intentional. The barrier to entry is high on purpose. He's actually trying to keep people out, right? And he clearly, Rema is a young man, but he's clearly aware of the history of African music. He's clearly aware of the history of Black music more broadly. The life cycle of Black music is essentially a thing is invented, the mainstream narcoticizes it, criminalizes it in some way. They fail to understand it. Eventually they try to copy or duplicate it. Then it becomes watered down and Black people move on to create the next thing. The blues, jazz, hip hop, rock and roll, reggae, and even Afrobeat. This is like a bulwark against that to that point.
Okay, but I think if you take the idea of this being a bulwark against that, I hesitate to even ask this next question, but this seems to be the obvious question to ask, which is to say, will this change an audience's perspective of what an Afrobeat song is? And by an audience, I guess I'm kind of actively meaning a Western audience who have been engaging with this music for some time. They're going to hear this and go, can I absorb this into my idea what Afrobeat is supposed to be?
I think, honestly, it definitely has the potential to, but I think it's important to say that the initial reaction a lot of people have had and are going to have naturally is a kind of rejection. There are, for example, in addition to the kind of sonic language of the album, there is a visual language as well, and it is equally as localized. Rema is from Benin City, Nigeria, a city that is outside the country's power center in Lagos. Anyone familiar with this part of the world will know that, a lot of art from Benin was pilfered by Europe and is currently being held in places like the British Museum, for example. And Rema has tried to embrace this tradition as a way of reclaiming a thing that was taken. So when he comes out on shows, he'll wear masks indigenous to this part of Nigeria and other forms of cultural production. People that aren't familiar with this tradition, they are calling the things that he's wearing Satanist, or they're coloring the use of these images as somehow evil or anti-God or anti-civilization. And he has talked about the fact that this is deeply heartbreaking for him, and which I think is really honest from him. But, in addition to that, I think it also has the power to like culturally change the way African music sounds, to your actual question. And, to push back against a kind of Wakandification thing that happens where artists have to embody Africa as this like fictional, intangible, aspirational place that may or may not actually exist. Like a portrait of a continent that's not indicative of people as they actually exist or their lives. Which is why, to this point, a lot of the African music that crosses over, quote unquote, is happy, is feel good, and is deeply non-threatening, right? And so, like, this record is not only delivered in another language, but the sounds and images associated with it are like menacing and libertine and moody and sardonic. And he is situating it intentionally in this climate of darkness. So people that will go on to listen to it will hear that Rema is often like gutturally screaming on the project, or he's playing with the orientation of his voice. There's a certain like darkness and vengeance at the core of it. It's a deeply radical piece of music. And I think there's no reason to think that it won't inspire other artists, African artists in particular, to dig into the most radical, honest, uncompromising parts of themselves when creating something.
Matt, there's no good reason I can think of why you don't write a book called The Wakandification of something. All I'm saying is that's got to go in a phrase, in a thing. But in the meantime, I got to leave it there. I really appreciate your time, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, man.
Of course. Matt Amha is a journalist and culture critic based in Toronto. Rema's new album, He is out on all streaming platforms. And that is it for the podcast today. Listen, my name is Alamin Abdul Mahmoud. This show is called Commotion. We'll see you tomorrow.